When you look at a painting in a museum, do you usually pay attention to what mediums are used for that painting? Here's the Coronation of Napoleon by Jacques-Louis David, made using oil paint, the most popular medium for painters across art history. And here is a view of the Grand Canal in Venice by Federico del Campo, an artist I discussed last week, painted using watercolor. And these are the two most famous works by Sandro Botticelli, both painted using tempera. Each of these mediums has its pros and cons when painting, and in this video I want to discuss the use of tempera in some more detail and compare it with alternative mediums. Tempera is a type of paint that consists of colored pigments mixed with a water-soluble binder, something that has adhesive properties to hold the paint together. The most common type of tempera is egg tempera, where the raw pigments are mixed with egg yolk and some water as the binders. Some of its main characteristics are that it is a fast-drying medium, it has a more matte appearance than the glossiness of oil paint, and it is long-lasting, meaning that an old painting in this medium deteriorates much slower than, for example, an oil or watercolor painting. If you want to paint beautiful details in your artwork, it is easiest to use oil paint. As it does not dry that quickly, you can easily correct mistakes and you can mix all sorts of colors on the canvas. It was one of the reasons that Jan van Eyck could paint some incredible details in his art. The only problem was that before Jan van Eyck, oil paint was not invented yet, so there was no possibility to use it. Until the beginning of the 15th century, tempera was the most popular medium, and that resulted in works like this, by artists like Giotto, Masaccio and Lippi. To apply tempera, you have to put thin strokes on the canvas, a lot of them, and if you would analyze a tempera painting, you may see many individual brushstrokes. And if the artist was really good, he or she could make very soft transitions between the different strokes and colors, but only because they would very carefully apply their delicate brushstrokes. The word tempera is derived from the Latin word temperare, which means mixing. It was already used in ancient Egypt, and while it was largely replaced by oil painting in Northern Europe from the 1430s onwards, it took a few decades longer to find its way to Renaissance Italy. Sandro Botticelli, for example, who lived between 1445 and 1510, used tempera all the time and never used oil paint. And even an artist like Raphael, who was born in 1483, painted some works still in tempera, although his most famous works were painted using oil paint. Mixed tempera paint dries quickly, which provides two challenges for the artist. First, it means that he or she needs to mix the paint in small quantities many times, as the paint on the palette dries out quickly. But it also means that it's harder to mix it on the canvas, which would, for example, be very helpful to fix any mistakes and to create all sorts of subtle shades of colors, like what is done in the sfumato technique, for example. And when I say that it dries quickly, I literally mean in seconds. So with the availability of oil painting, where you could mix larger quantities and correct and mix basically as much as you wanted, you would guess that that was the end of tempera. To a large extent, the answer is yes, but not completely so, and part of the answer is that over time artists also figured out little tricks to preserve the tempera better, for example by adding some vinegar or white wine. The famous Art Nouveau artist Alphonse Mucha, for example, experimented with various mediums during his life, and he concluded later in his career that there were also some unique benefits of egg tempera paint, because it was quicker drying, more luminous, and result in longer lasting artworks. So he painted his series of the Slav epic, his life's most important work, using egg tempera. The luminosity may not be that clear in these paintings, but you can clearly see that it has a different effect than using oil paint. It's just like the use of watercolor, of which these two artworks are luminous examples. Using a different medium just creates a different vibe, something that stands out from the many oil paintings. And tempera has the ability to create the feeling that the colors in a painting are changing sometimes, like what happens when you look at the gemstone. The reason for that is that various thin brushstrokes are applied on top of each other, so you are looking at times through multiple layers of paint. With a more expensive word, we can call that opalescence. Icon paintings are sacred works of art, where the beauty of the artwork is not as important as its primary purpose is to aid with religious devotion. These works were traditionally painted in tempera, as that was the best available paint before the Renaissance period. But that tradition still continues. Here you can see two works by Marianne Stokes, painted around the year 1900 with tempera. You can clearly see the luminosity in her works, which is partly caused by the varnish that is applied to it at the end. Relatively simple compositions, but with beautiful color contrast to make them quite powerful and expressive images. Just like Marianne Stokes, there have been other artists and movements over time who have rediscovered some of the unique results that tempera can achieve. And I would love to hear from you in the comments down below if you have any favorite works painted with tempera, old ones or newer ones. Around the turn of the 19th century, William Blake painted this using tempera. And look for example at this painting from 1926 by Otto Dix. He combined different mediums but used tempera for the background, which results in a pretty unique, luminous wall, providing an intriguing contrast to the portrait he painted. And how about The Scream by Edvard Munch, where you can clearly see those thin individual brushstrokes so typical for tempera. And whereas earlier artists would try to hide their brushstrokes, Munch decided that it was actually a great way of expressing himself. I know that there's much more to learn about tempera paint, but the main message is here that different mediums have different pros and cons, and a versatile artist may vary his or her medium depending on what they want to achieve. A glossy satin dress, for example, should not be painted using egg tempera, but using oil paint instead. So next time you go to the museum, it is worth looking into the different mediums that artists have used to recognize the unique qualities of each medium. Well, I hope you enjoyed this discussion. If you did, please hit the thumbs up button, subscribe and hit the notification bell to be alerted when new videos are released. Thanks for watching.